Dr. Amanda Allard. I had the pleasure of having lunch with her and some of the committee members yesterday. And she is such a genuine soul with so much to offer that I think that you will truly have lots of takeaways today. So please listen carefully and take some things away today that you can use in the future. Dr. Allard has a PhD in communication studies and is an educator and a business owner from Houston, Texas, raised in Sealy, Texas. She'll tell you more about herself, though, I'm sure. She has a bachelor's in communications from Concordia and earned an MA at Michigan State University, focusing on social support communications. Dr. Allard actively shares her expertise through adjunct teaching at Lone Star College, keynote presentations, and her research. A 2023 TEDx speaker, she discussed using empathy to combat loneliness and emphasizes the transformative power of communications in healing social disconnections. Dr. Amanda Allard.
Let's start with the story, shall we? There are many characters that are a part of this story, but the first one I would like to present is Johann Hari. You see, Hari is a writer and a journalist, and he has written many books, but the one I am going to reference is titled Lost Connections. The whole purpose of the book is essentially helping individuals go from lonely and depressed states and finding ways that they can connect more effectively through their work-life balance, their community, or even their families. But there was a specific chapter that really resonated with me, and it was titled, We Build This City. And the setting of this chapter is in Gutenberg, Berlin. And that's the first and the last time I'm going to refer to it as Gutenberg. For the remainder of the story and the speech, I will refer to it as Kati. The setting is 2011, and rent prices are skyrocketing. You see, Kati is described by Hari as the equivalent of the Bronx of Berlin. It's an area where there is lower socioeconomic status and poverty and often crime. It's a hodgepodge of individuals who live in this city. Specifically, enters our next character, Nuri Cengiz. She is a Turkish immigrant to Kati who has been living there for many years. Now, although Nuri is smiling in this picture, when the rent prices started to skyrocket in 2011, she received a notice explaining that she was going to be evicted. She couldn't make payment. And out of fear of not being able to make payment, she made a very decisive decision. And she made that decision by writing it on a piece of paper. You see, she was sitting at home, she wrote on a piece of paper, she said, due to the increased rent prices, I'm going to be evicted. But I just would like to let whoever comes to evict me know that I am most likely unalive. She then, according to Hari, crawls out of her wheelchair and posts this note in her window. And to her surprise, people start knocking on her door to check in on her, just to make sure she's okay. One of the individuals who knocks on the door is one of the lead protesters of a protesting group that's trying to lower the rent prices in Kati. And she says, hey, I really think you should come out and protest with us. I think you'd be great. Nuri thought this was silly. Me, protest in a wheelchair? Well, one day, she rolls out and she begins to protest. And this is her protesting in this picture. She was shocked to find that a woman in a wheelchair with a pot around her neck and a headscarf drew a lot of attention by the media. It not only drew attention from the media, but it also drew attention of the local law enforcement. You see, the local law enforcement essentially told the protesters, hey, this is great, but you guys are actually protesting on a road that's blocking entry into a major city, Berlin. Out of fear that the police officers were going to tear down their protesting site that they had constructed, they devised a plan to pair up and have protesting watches throughout the evening, so essentially 24/7. This is where our third character comes into play, Tanya. Now, this is an AI-generated photo of Tanya based on how Hari describes her as a middle-aged single woman who has bleached hair, sleeve tattoos, and is in a miniskirt. He essentially says, Tanya and Nuri are on paper, you would never think would be able to connect. They look completely different. They're in different age groups and from different backgrounds. But lo and behold, the first night that Nuri has to hold watch, she is paired with Tanya. And they start to talk. And they come to find that they're not so different after all. But in fact, they both were immigrants who had come to the country and the city. And they had come at very early ages. They are connecting. And by the end of the night, Nuri feels so confident and comfortable with Tanya that she discloses a secret that she hasn't shared with anyone ever before. And that secret was regarding how her husband had passed away. You see, Nuri had told everyone that her husband had died due to a heart attack. But in reality, he had died due to tuberculosis, which is a disease often associated with death of the individuals who are of the lower socioeconomic class. She was ashamed. That night, a connection happened, and we're already seeing the power of how communication between two individuals can help an individual feel connected and come out of a very lonely state. But not only did people connect one-on-one within the protesting story within Kati, but also the community started to connect. So this is Club Sudblock. Club Sudblock is known as an LGBTQ+ bar. When it came into the community, it received a lot of flack and shame from many of the individuals who lived within Kati. But when they saw what the protesters within the community were doing, they offered shelter to the protesters, such as tents and chairs. They offered food and coffee to individuals who were working overnight to protest. And they even offered a meeting space so that individuals could come together to strategically devise a plan to effectively protest as a community. Not only did Club Sudblock come through, but so did some local construction workers. You see, some local construction workers had noticed that the people of Kati were protesting come rain, shine, snow, you name it. And they had some extra material laying around. And so they said, we're not only going to donate this extra material to you, but we're also going to build you a shelter so that you can meet at your local protesting spot. And this is a picture of the shelter that was built called Kati & Co., and it is still there today. So we have connection between individuals within the community. We see businesses connecting with each other. But now enters my fourth and final character, which is an outsider who is actually going to give support to the people of Kati. You see, this is Tung Kai. And this is an AI-generated photo of how Johan Hari defines or describes Tung Kai. Tung Kai literally stumbles upon the people of Kati, and he falls in love with it. So much so that he starts to pick up trash at the local protest site. He begins to transfer coffee to and from Club Sudblock, and he's so adored by the community that people actually start offering him food, shelter, and clothing. All up until he was able to get a full-time employment at Club Sudblock. Tung Kai is a very affectionate individual, and one day, while protesting, there's an altercation that occurs between a civilian and an officer. And in the hopes to defuse the situation, Tung Kai runs up to the officer and hugs him to try and mitigate the situation. When he hugs the officer, he is unfortunately arrested. What's even more unfortunate is we learn of Tunkai's past. You see, Tunkai had actually escaped from a psychiatric hospital a few months before arriving at Kati. In fact, he has been in and out of psychiatric hospitals his whole life and has escaped multiple times. When this comes to revelation, the police officers send him right back. But when the people of Kati hear about this, they're appalled. They love Tunkai. So what do? They protest. They sign a petition. They protest for 8 solid weeks before they finally are able to get the psychiatric hospital to work with the city to release Tunkai back to the city of Kati under certain circumstances. This is the ending of Tunkai's story in Kati within the chapter. But let's go back to, where's Nuri? Unfortunately, Nuri is also evicted, like we predicted at the beginning of the story. But she's alive. And she had made so many connections within the community that she actually moved in with some local residents. The people of Kati protested for a solid year before politicians became involved and actually froze the raised rent prices. While Johan Hari comes back and is learning about this event, he's wrapping up his final interviews and he speaks with 2 local residents, Tanya and Sandy. Tanya says, if you are down, you are made to feel that it is only you in your house, that it is only you. Sandy says, a lot of people are lonely. They pull back extremely lonely. Nuri had been so depressed, she was actually going to harm herself. But then, because of the protests, they became very political people again. It was like therapy for us. The people of Kati, after they were able to freeze those rent prices, went on to help other local communities by sharing what they had learned in terms of their social connectedness, because essentially not only did individuals within the community were able to come out of loneliness, but the entire community was able to come out of loneliness. And so how do we go from lonely to connected? It kind of seems like it's this magic solution, but in reality, the solution is something that we do every day. But before I get to that, we need to understand, what is loneliness? Like it was previously stated, we are in the middle of a loneliness epidemic, according to Dr. Murthy, the U.S. Surgeon General. He states that approximately half of U.S. adults report experiencing loneliness, with some of the highest rates being amongst young adults. He also explains that individuals who make under $50,000 a year are twice as likely as being lonely compared to individuals who make over $50,000 a year. He explains that loneliness in our country is a bigger problem than other health concerns such as obesity, diabetes, and other life-threatening events. But loneliness is defined by him in his report as a subjective, distressing experience that results from perceived isolation or inadequate meaningful connections, where inadequate refers to the discrepancy or unmet need between an individual's preferred and actual experience. Let me break that down. Essentially, loneliness is our feeling of how connected we are with individuals within the world. This is why maybe we work remote and I'm physically alone, but I don't feel lonely. I actually feel the opposite. I feel like I have tons of people I can call. This is because you most likely have a great network of positive social relationships. In contrast, maybe you're surrounded in a room full of people and you're not physically alone, but you feel unbelievably lonely because you don't have those connections and those relationships. That is called social connection, and he defines it as a continuum of the size and diversity of one's social network and roles, the functions these relationships serve, and their positive or negative qualities. Essentially, interpersonal relationships, right? These interpersonal relationships are important to who we are as humans because it fits our innate fundamental human need to belong which is the feeling of having deep connections within our social groups and within our families. So if we want this, right, we all want to get out of loneliness and get to a more connected state, whether it's within our families or our communities. We want a big group of friends. We want to have those positive relationships. We want to find love, not just romantic, but that friendship love, that familial love. We need to improve our communication skills. And we do this by understanding what communication is at a fundamental standpoint. We self-reflect and gain self-awareness of how our previous communication experiences influence how we communicate today. And we begin learning and practicing how to have effective dyadic communication between those around us. Are we ready? Let's jump in. When I started learning about communication, I had a professor refer to it as magic. Magic? Communication is magic? I want to be a magician. Essentially, communication is this really cool thing that we all take for granted. You see, we as humans have this innate ability to use language. And language helps us communicate how we feel inside, and then it gets sent to someone else, and they can feel how I feel inside and understand it. This is what sets us apart from all other species, is our ability to communicate. But we do it so often and on a daily basis that we often take our power to communicate for granted. And when we really start to uncover the magic behind communication, it's almost like uncovering the wizard behind the cloak, right? So if we look at this transactional model, let's break it down, because this is the bare bones of what goes into just a simple message. So we have an encoder and a decoder. The encoder I'll refer to as person A periodically, and the decoder I'll refer to as person B periodically. You see, the encoder has the challenge of even constructing a message. Let's say the message is, I'm lonely. 2 words, I'm lonely. You would think that that message being sent from the encoder to the decoder, pretty simple. It's a simple message, 2 words. But the decoder not only has to receive that, make sense of it through all of this, but then decode what the individual is saying, then encode another message and send it back to person A. But there's more. Yeah. They have to get through all of this, and this is the wizard behind the cloak. So not only does the person have to come up with the message of encoding it, they have to have co-creation of meaning, meaning we have to speak the same language. If person A says, I'm lonely in Portuguese, I can't decode that. So not only do we have to have co-creation of meaning, we have to take into account physical and psychological context. If the decoder is coming out of a very traumatic experience, are they going to be able to decode the message, I'm lonely, effectively? Probably not. Similarly, there's cultural context. What are the cultural norms behind someone saying that publicly? Then there's the relational context. What if person A is the boss and person B is the employee? What if this is wife and husband, mother, child? And then there's social context. Where are we at? What are the social norms related to this message? But not just that gets taken into effect. We also have lightning bolts coming down trying to hinder our messages. And these lightning bolts are noise, or just things that can interfere with your message effectively making it to the next person. So for example, if I'm trying to say, hey, I'm really lonely, and the decoder gets a phone call in the middle of my message, do you think they're going to be able to receive it well? Probably not. Similarly, noise can be the channel in which the message is sent. Is it being sent via email? Is it sent via text message? How is it being communicated? Can all impact how our message is received. And that's just with a simple message of I'm lonely. Now that we understand the foundation of what makes up communication, we now can take a step back and begin to be a little bit more reflective of how our past has influenced our communication. And that's where I would like to share my story of self-awareness of my communication skills. You see, when I was younger, my mother was falsely accused of committing a crime and was incarcerated for 12 months, but served 10 and was released on good behavior. This is a picture of my family visiting my mother while she was in a federal prison. During this time, my mother experienced the traumatic effects of being incarcerated. Similarly, myself, my brother, and my father experienced secondhand incarceration, which is essentially the mental imprisonment of when you have a loved one who's incarcerated. It is very safe to say that I was unbelievably lonely and depressed during this time. When my mother was released, the communication dynamics changed drastically within our family dynamic. You see, there was a lot of shame around her incarceration, and we kept it a secret for many, many years. It actually wasn't until I went off to Concordia, University of Texas, that I started to share this secret. Because you see, this secret had started impacting my relationships around me. I didn't want people to know this deep, dark secret that I had held on to for so long. I also didn't want to admit how traumatic that event was and played a role in who I am today. But it wasn't until I was going in regularly to meet with my communication mentor, who I told everything to. And we talked about communication and research, but I was able to also share some personal life events. And I was struggling with being connected with people around me. Even though it seemed like I wasn't, I really was. I didn't have really close relationships. And my mentor looked at me very kindly and said, "You know you're the common denominator amongst all these relationships, right?" And it really kind of sparked my thinking of, oh my goodness, I'm the problem. And she looked at me and she said, "You have to fix your communication skills. You see, the way you've been communicating with people for years is not working. So you have to try something different." So she gave me a task, one homework assignment that semester. And she said, "I need you to go out and I need you to make a friend. And when you engage in conflict with that friend, don't put up an avoidant attachment style in a wall and leave and not communicate. Stick through it. Deal with the uncomfortable nature of it." And I did. And I left Concordia with 3 lifelong friends and have since made tons and was able to get myself out of this loneliness, despair that I was in, and was able to connect with the people around me. In fact, I have a book club and I have girls' nights, and it's a lot more fun than being lonely, I swear, I promise. So when I found this solution, I wanted to learn more. So I went off to Michigan State, where I started to uncover and teach others how to connect and communicate effectively within their relationships. More specifically, I started studying social support, which now we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of how we effectively communicate with individuals around us. But first, we have to define what social support is. Social support is defined as the perception or experience that one is loved and cared for by others, esteemed and valued, and part of a social network of mutual assistance and obligations. You see, social support in the research or communication research is broken up into 2 kind of umbrellas: nurturance support and action facilitated support. Nurturance support is comprised of emotional, esteem, and network support. And it's important that we pay attention to these because they will play a role throughout the remainder of this speech. So emotional support includes expressions of care and comfort, whether it be verbally or non-verbally. Esteem support is including validation or compliments that bolsters one's perceptions of themselves, so their overall self-esteem. Network support occurs when an individual utilizes their connections to gain and or provide support to other individuals. Action facilitated support is kind of how it sounds. There's some actions that go on with it. And there are two types of support under this umbrella, which include informational and tangible support. Informational support is a type of support that focuses on guidance or advice. I want you to think of this type of support as you go to a hotel and you're in a city you never have been to, and you ask the front desk clerk, hey, what's something fun to do around here? And they say, oh, you should go to the water park or the aquarium or the downtown square. These are forms or messages of informational support. Tangible support occurs when an individual requests or provides provision of resources. So if any of you are parents and your child comes up to you and says, hey, can I have 20 bucks? And you give it to them, that's tangible support. So I started working with Dr. Amanda Holmstrom when I worked at Michigan State University, and she and her advisor came up with the cognitive emotional theory of esteem support messages, which you all have to remember by the end of the day, and I will quiz you if I see you, okay? I'm just kidding. It took me 2 solid years to probably get that down. But just refer to it as the CETism, okay? Essentially, Dr. Holmstrom found and knew that esteem support messages have been linked to our ability to connect with others effectively, and it enhanced our mental and physical health. So her overall arching research question was, how is an individual making reattributions about a stressor? Let's break that question down, okay? So essentially, she was interested in acute stressors. What are acute stressors? These are minor transgressions that result in temporary stress, such as you failed an exam, you got dumped, maybe you got a ticket or a DWI. You see, these are transgressions that cause stress and turmoil for us as humans, but they don't impact who we are 50 years from now. It's important that I distinguish this because when we did research, we did not look at chronic stress or chronic stressors such as traumatic events such as emotional, physical, or sexual abuse. We wanted to understand, okay, you just dealt with this acute stressor. Someone's probably giving you support. How does that supportive message impact how you reappraise the event and view your self-esteem? She was specifically interested in 2 different types of messages: emotion-focused messages and problem-focused messages. Emotion-focused messages focus on the support recipient's emotions, cognitions, and self-esteem when they construct the message. In contrast, a problem-focused message is concerned more about the changes in behavior that the support recipient can engage in. So I want you all to imagine something with me. I want you to imagine you're trying to get into grad school and you just failed an exam. Some of you are already sweating because our communicative past, we're freaking out that we're gonna have to tell our parents that we failed an exam. And then some of us are like, big whoop, I failed an exam. Doesn't impact who I am. But for the sake of this activity, please just imagine that this is a big exam and it really means a lot to you. And you just walked out of taking the test and you run into me and you tell me that you failed. I'm gonna read 2 messages to you and I want you to decide which one you find to be the most effective. So you just ran into me, okay? And tell me you failed. I say, hey, I want you to know that I can see all the effort you are putting into studying and trying to get good grades so that you can get into medical school. I think you have a lot to offer to any study group that you attend. And please know that if you ever need someone to continue talking to about this, I'm here for you. Or you run into me, say, I failed the exam. And I say, have you ever tried to join a different study group for this class? If there is one, doing that might be helpful. Or another idea is to start your own study group with other students in your class who might also be interested in medical school. I think it could also be useful if you hit up your professor's office hours. What the research showed when we would test these messages is that emotion-focused messages were more effective at helping individuals reappraise an acute stressful event. and helping bolster their self-esteem. But I'm not going to sit here and say that problem-focused messages are garbage. There's a place for them. And oftentimes, when we engage in the real-world communication, we often intermingle the two, okay? But I'm going to break down these messages even more, because if you're like, wow, that EF message was great, but I'm not that type. I'm the problem-focused type. How do I even begin to think about constructing that message? I'm going to give you 3 simple attributes that you can add together to formulate a message. So think of it almost like an equation. EF messages are comprised of attributions, relevancy, and truthfulness. So addressing attributions meaning the message's cognitive attributions made about the stressor, such as, I think you have a lot to offer. I'm saying you're a hard worker. I'm saying you're so smart and intelligent. These are things that I have to know you to be able to speak on them effectively. Similarly, everything stated in this message is relevant. So they're relevant to the transgression or stressor currently being handled. So I'm not saying, hey, remember that time you passed that spelling test in 2nd grade? You got it. It's not relevant to the problem at hand. Similarly, we add in truthfulness. So none of the statements made within the message were untruthful in nature. So I'm not saying, so let's say we're an associate, not so much a friend, and I say like, hey, I've known for years that you're a smart person. It's not truthful. I've only known you for about 6 months, right? So you want the messages to address multiple cognitive attributions, be relevant, and also truthful. When we break down problem-focused messages, they also are comprised of 3 main components. First, they address multiple behavioral changes. So we saw this in the message where it said, have you thought about a study group? Have you thought about office hours? Have you tried note cards? All of these things are behavioral changes that the individual experiencing the stressor can engage in to overcome the stressful event. Similarly, it's also relevant. We're not talking about something from 2nd grade. But then thirdly, it has a realistic impact. So I wouldn't say, hey, you just failed this exam. Have you ever tried like running on a treadmill to get better grades? It's not a realistic impact. It's not going to impact, like there's no correlation between running on a treadmill and higher grades. If there was a study for it, I'd love to see it. But essentially, these are how we broke down the messages. It's a lot. Let's take a beat, right? Because I remember the first time I started learning about like, whoa, this is how I'm supposed to construct messages on a daily basis. Mind you, I'm coming from a standpoint of, I'm terrible at communication. I'm not good at social support, right? So like when people would have problems, I was the one with like a broom like a mile away trying to pat them, So the first time I tried constructing these messages, it literally felt like a baby giraffe trying to walk for the first time. It was like, I think you are smart, and I want you to know I care for you. It was very wonky. But what I will say is that I stayed in that uncomfortable state. I pushed myself. And now my husband loves it when I give him a little supportive message, and he's like, I know that one, Yeah. But they're good, and they are effective at helping bolster esteem. So not only can our words really impact helping others become more connected with each other, but so do our nonverbal social support. Let me explain. This is where invisible support comes into play. Invisible support occurs when support is provided so seamlessly that it goes unnoticed by the recipient, often because it's outside of their conscious awareness. This was the definition provided by Bolger and his colleagues in 2001. And they did this really unique dyadic diary study between couples. You see, he was looking at couples where one of the individuals was studying for the LSAT, which is a very stressful exam that helps individuals get into grad school for law. So essentially what he did is we have Johnny B up at the top and we have Susie Q at the bottom. All right, Johnny B is doing the dishes and Susie Q is working at the desk studying for the LSAT. Every night for quite a bit of time, he asked them to write down what support was given and what support was received. It was considered to be invisible support when the individual did not identify the other individual as doing something supportive for them. So let's say Johnny B did the dishes and he goes home at night and says, oh, I did the dishes for Susie Q because I know she hates it when the dishes are full. But then Susie Q goes home and says, Johnny didn't do anything for me. This is considered invisible support. Now, individuals and researchers tried to replicate Bolger's findings of what it meant to engage in invisible support, but there were some differing findings. So when our research team started to explore it, we realized that we couldn't test this quantitatively. We needed to get qualitative data and understand what are people even describing invisible support as in their daily lives. And that's where the results for our study called Seeing Invisible Support came through. You see, we identified 5 different types of invisible support that individuals can engage in. The first one is hidden tangible support. And this is when the support provider offers tangible help without drawing attention to themselves. Participant 5152 gave this really unique story that I want to share with you. He said, my grandfather was convinced that my Bluetooth speaker had an Alexa function because it looked similar to the Amazon speaker he had at home. He kept calling to it saying, hey Alexa, play some music. He was getting frustrated, so I just connected to the speaker and I played songs he knew he liked from the other room. Cute, right? That is an example of hidden tangible support. Then there's marshaling the receiver's network. So instead of directly helping the receiver, the support provider recruits individuals within the recipient's network. An example of this might be your best friend calls you up and says, I just got dumped. And instead of being like, I'm gonna call everyone and we're gonna get together so that we can give you all the support, you just hang up the phone and then you call all your friends kind of secretly and say, hey, Sarah just got dumped, don't bring it up, right? Try and create normalcy for her, which leads to the third out of our 5 invisible support types, which is creating normalcy, which is when you maintain a routine interaction to help the receiver feel like nothing's changed. Their life is completely normal. Our 2 final types of invisible support are establishing mutual self-distress and unspoken social presence. So establishing mutual self-distress is essentially when you make it seem like you're also in distress to kind of mitigate the other person's distress, so you're hiding it. Participant 5107 said, I tried to make this person feel comfortable by grabbing myself a water and offered it to them. I tried to mask it as if I was doing it for them, as if I needed these things as well. Unspoken social presence is similar to creating normalcy, but it's a little bit different. You see, unspoken social presence is when you are just physically sitting there and listening to the individual. Not offering any verbal or nonverbal support, you're just present. You see, invisible support is something that I find really interesting, and while we were conducting this study, it made me reflect on when my mother was incarcerated. You see, that time period was traumatic for me. And to this day, it's very choppy in my memory. But I remember that individuals did give me and my family different types of support. One of those individuals was my aunt. But I couldn't remember what type of support she had given me. I was like, I knew she threw a birthday party for me, within the family. I knew she took me to this baseball game. And I remember she gave me some informational support on how to become a woman. But that's about it. So I called her. I said, hey, I'm doing this study on seeing invisible support. And obviously this time period is very shaky for me. Can you just tell me everything you did for me? To my surprise and my memory, she was there every week, helping myself and my family. She was helping me go to and from softball games. She was helping me become a woman. She was listening to me. She was providing social support and invisible support. And although I don't remember it all the way, I know it was beneficial for me. because it had a lasting impact on me 20 years later. Sometimes we need verbal and sometimes we need nonverbal. And it's important that we give this to individuals who are dealing with a stressful event, because similar to the people of Kati, you never know when you're going to need it again. It's kind of like the Good Samaritan effect, right? And our innate human ability to want reciprocity. So if you give social support, there may be a time where the individual you gave it to is the one giving it back. So, moving forward in terms of social support, these are some things I want you to leave with today. When you or someone else needs support, clearly communicate what type of support you need. Wouldn't it be so helpful if when you needed support, you could easily say, hey, I don't need esteem support right now, I need information, right? It could help the decoder understand what you truly need. And it can help you formulate your message as well. Focus on emotional supportive messages that address emotions and self-esteem. Because like I said, research has renownedly shown that these are the most effective at helping people reappraise the stressful events. And then always help others, as this not only helps them, but can also alleviate your own loneliness. That night in Kati, when Tanya and Nuri were sitting there, I would lay money that tons of social support was happening that night between each other. But not only in the story that I talked about earlier was there social support, but then there was communal coping. Communal coping is the pooling of resources and efforts of several individuals to confront adversity. And you can communally cope within a protest group, within a community, but you can also communally cope with as a couple, you and your partner. You can communally cope as a family, or even like a larger family dynamic. Communal coping has been looked at in multiple different research studies in terms of like how do individuals overcome a stressful event. They've looked at individuals overcoming natural disasters, individuals who are overcoming difficult team structures through sports and athletics, and they've also looked at how couples and families communally cope to overcome really terrible disease diagnoses such as cancer. Communal coping is mainly comprised of two variables: joint actions and shared appraisals. Joint actions are kind of like how they sound. These are actions that individuals are doing together to overcome the stressful event. Shared appraisals are when you appraise the event or view the event as something we are dealing with instead of I'm dealing with. But I'm gonna make it a little bit more complicated. Don't worry, I'm gonna break this down, don't worry. This is the communal coping model. And what we can see here is that we have appraisals and we have joint actions. And we have these arrows that are kind of circular, meaning that the relationship between shared appraisals and joint actions are recursive in nature. One doesn't typically come before the other, but they kind of go in this circular motion. However, Afifi and colleagues, the individuals who created this model, argue that oftentimes it's shared appraisals that help lead us to joint actions. And ultimately, we can range in terms of how much we feel we're sharing appraisals or engaging in joint actions within our community and individually. But obviously, the goal is to become connected with others. So our outcome variable is resiliency and thriving. We want to live our most abundant life. Now in this box, these are moderators and mediators. And I want you to think of these as like dominoes, right? So we're setting up all these dominoes to lead to the end goal, which is connection, right? Well, some dominoes are bigger than other dominoes. And when you have a bigger domino, the strength of that domino pushes the other variable and has a ripple effect down the line to the outcome variable. So some variables that can strengthen the relationship between communal coping and thriving are how connected we are with individuals, the nature of the stressor, our ability to reframe the event, our viewpoint on our self-efficacy or our ability to actually overcome the stressor, are all things that can influence the relationship between communal coping and flourishing. Now, I just said flourishing, and that's what I essentially looked at with the study I'm about to talk about. You see, resiliency and thriving conceptually can get muddied. They can sometimes seem like two very, very different concepts. And so I chose to look at flourishing because an individual is flourishing when they have a balanced life and they feel good about their life and they're functioning well. I felt like it really encompassed everything that both resiliency and thriving were trying to communicate. What better time to understand communal coping and wanting to get to a place of flourishing and connectedness than a time that really impacted a lot of us in terms of our isolation and loneliness? The COVID-19 pandemic. You see, the COVID-19 pandemic occurred, and I started learning about communal coping, and I was studying social support, and I decided to conduct a study titled Coping with COVID-19, How Different Support Types Interact with Communal Coping. I was sitting there and I was like, okay, what do we know that's going on right now during the pandemic? We know that nurture support, such as emotional esteem and network support, like I described earlier, can be beneficial to an individual trying to communally cope to overcome a stressor. Okay, communal coping is comprised of joint actions and shared appraisals. During the pandemic, people were isolated, right? We were not living our most connected and fulfilled life. I also knew that we were engaging in these things called Zoom parties, and I don't know about you, but I vividly remember multiple times being like, oh, I'm so glad we're in this together, like, thank you for joining this Zoom call, right? And then another crazy thing happened. I started seeing, like, people in the neighborhood walking with their family all the time, just at any hour of the day, and that's because I knew we were engaging in joint actions as families and as individuals, because we were dealing with the stressful event of COVID-19. So I predicted that, hey, many of us are actually forced into joint actions during the pandemic. For example, maybe you had a roommate during that time and you didn't really hang out much, but all of a sudden you were hanging out all the time. And so you were engaging in joint actions. I predicted that joint actions would lead to us feeling like, hey, we're in this together, and that when these two variables are at play, it impacts our ability to flourish and feel connected like we're overcoming this pandemic. I also wanted to know, hey, how is social support strengthening or impacting our ability to communally cope and flourish? Which social supportive messages are the most effective during this time? So I looked at action-facilitated support, which, just as a reminder, is informational and tangible, and nurturance support. I collected data from over 236 individuals from the community and a college sample. They were administered a Qualtrics study, and ultimately my outcome variables I was looking at included social support, communal coping, and flourishing. And this is what I found. We found that the model makes sense, right? Joint actions did have a relationship with shared appraisals on flourishing, so people were communally coping during COVID-19. But we also found that informational and tangible support significantly interacted with joint actions. Let me break that down. So if you look at this graph, essentially what we found was that informational and tangible support were those dominoes, those big dominoes that strengthened the relationship between joint actions on shared appraisals. So it was like, if you were engaging in informational and tangible support and you were engaging in joint actions, oh, we definitely felt like we were in this together, coping with COVID-19. But something was interesting when I looked at this graph. If you look at the middle line, this is the mean, or the average of where everybody kind of landed. The line right underneath it, or above it, the solid line, was individuals who were slightly under the average in terms of informational support. And the dotted line were individuals who were over in terms of provided informational support. What this tells us is that essentially, if you were a little bit under the mean or the average, it was more effective at making you feel like you were in this together with another person, and it increased your joint actions. It's kind of contrary to what you would think, right? You would think, oh, I need to give more support, more informational support. This will really make us feel like we're in this together. But this is when I have to refer back to social support. You see, there's a whole body of research that looks at over-benefited versus under-benefited support. And essentially what they find, oftentimes, is that when an individual is over-benefited in terms of the amount of social support they're receiving, it's just as detrimental as if they were receiving no support at all. And this makes a lot of logical sense, right? If I just failed an exam and you give me a supportive message, yeah, I might feel better. But if you come to me every day and you give me a supportive message every single day, I'm gonna be like, dude, back off, right? Like, I got it. Like, I'm a cool person. I'm smart. I'll keep working hard, right? So essentially what this is showing us is that there's kind of this sweet spot in terms of how social support can interact with our ability to engage in joint actions and shared appraisals on a connected life. We not only found that with informational and tangible support, but we also saw that with network support, which kind of makes sense, right? During the pandemic, I wanted information about, hey, do you know something I don't know about when this pandemic is gonna be over? Or, you got toilet paper? You gonna give it to me? Yeah. So, and then network, right? I wanted to be on a Zoom party. I was trying to build my network. You got a network I can join? It makes sense why these types of social support were helping individuals communally cope. Now, we didn't see the same effects for emotional and esteem support, but I would like to highlight that does not mean that they are not beneficial, but in fact, they maybe had their own place and maybe weren't so related to the nature of the stressful event. I talk about communal coping and social support being combined because, again, like the people in Kati, not only were they engaging in communal coping, but they were also engaging in social support. And this is another little added part to the magic of communication. It's this complex thing that we all do, but it helps us so much get out of loneliness and into a more connected life. My third and final communication tactic that we are going to discuss today may arguably one of the toughest to develop. And I started to learn how to teach it and develop it with a class titled COM 320, and it was known as Diversity and Communication. You see, when you're a grad student, you're told what to teach. And in the summer of 2022, I was told that I had to teach COM 320, Diversity and Communication. I was petrified. It's 2022. Instructors are getting canceled left and right for having complex conversations about politics, sex, religion, race. But when I got through that 6-week class, I was begging the department chair to let me teach it for the remainder of my time at Michigan State, because I found that I had this really cool opportunity to teach people how to be kind and empathetic by using their words. So I used textbooks such as Differences Matter, which they weren't really textbooks. These are more of books that you can get off of Amazon or Barnes & Noble. But Differences Matter was my statistical textbook that really looked at what are the statistics related to these demographics. I used the book The Art of Empathy by Carla McLaren, which assessed how do we communicate empathy intrapersonally and interpersonally. And then I used a book called I Never Thought of It That Way by Monica Guzman. And she had this really neat scenario where she used a mountain to just illustrate what she was trying to communicate. And this was something that I think we all need to be mindful of. You see, a lot of times when it comes to complex conversations such as politics, it can often feel like we're on one side of the mountain and the other person is on the other side. She describes it like this because Monica is very openly proud to be a Democrat. Similarly, her parents are proud to be Republican. And she explains that we need to imagine like, hey, we are on one side of the mountain and we essentially have a rope around the mountain. And when we communicate, we are constantly trying to pull each other up and try and make it to the tippy top of the mountain, which is essentially a level of understanding and connectedness. Now, I'm not saying that you're not going to hit some snags on this mountain, and it might get rocky, and it might get bumpy, and you may need to take a break from walking up that mountain, right? But this is just a visual illustration of what we are all trying to get to when we communicate with others when it comes to empathy. And this is when I want to highlight one of my biggest struggles with the course. My biggest struggle was over the chapter regarding the LGBTQ plus community. And it wasn't a struggle because I couldn't teach the information. It was a struggle because I'm sitting here trying to teach empathy and understanding, but I'm a straight female. That's how I identify. I'm not giving the students a clear representation of this community group. And it was during the summer when I was planning and prepping for the course that I went with my good friend to go to a tattoo shop. And her tattoo artist was Cecil. And Cecil was born biologically a female and was transitioning to be a male. I had tons of questions. And luckily, Cecil was very open and receptive to answering all of them. I asked about their communication past, what the social norm differences were between men and women, what it was like to be on hormone therapy, you name it. And Cecil was open. He wanted to talk about it. He wanted to share that information with people. So that's when I decided I am not the best person to teach my students about the LGBTQ plus community. The LGBTQ plus community are the best individuals to teach my students about their community. So I formulated a panel. On this panel was Cecil, an individual who identified as gay, an individual who identified as lesbian, and an individual who had originally identified as bisexual but transitioned to identifying as straight. Weeks before, I had students devise questions that I would ask them at an 8 a.m. Zoom panel, and we did it. It was an hour and a half long, and I want to share a letter I got at the end of the year from one of my students regarding this panel. The student said, "An activity that really changed my perspective about the world was the LGBTQ plus panel. I never really understood the community growing up outside of the fact that same-sex relationships were not okay, which really developed a bias towards people within that community. Listening to the panelists share their stories made me feel bad about the way I had treated them, and I learned the valuable lesson of loving people for themselves and not just their sexual identity." This is empathy. This is coming to an understanding of where other people are at, and it comes from listening and hearing and trying to understand another person. But before I break down what empathy is, I must clarify what it is not. Empathy is not sympathy. So when you think of sympathy, I want you to think of acknowledgement. Think of someone as acknowledging that you're going through a hard time. So for example, this is kind of like getting a get well soon balloon when you're in the hospital. It's sympathetic. I can see that you're acknowledging my pain, but you don't understand it. Compassion is different from empathy, even though it can sometimes be couched within it depending on how you're conceptually looking at it. But when you think of compassion, I want you to think of someone taking action and doing compassionate acts to help the individual. Again, doing compassionate acts does not mean that you understand where the individual is at. So like, for example, that student could have been marching for LGBTQ plus rights, and that's an act showing compassion for the community. But did they truly understand where they're coming from? That's where empathy comes into play. You see, empathy is defined by Carla McLaren, the author of The Art of Empathy, as a social and emotional skill that helps us feel and understand the emotions, circumstances, intentions, thoughts, and needs of others, such that we can offer sensitive, perspective, and appropriate communication and support. And I'm going to highlight appropriate communication and support here. But empathy isn't this thing that you just have or you don't have, right? In fact, we all kind of fall along this continuum. And some individuals may think, well, I want to be highly empathetic. That's where I want to be. But in reality, being highly empathetic can be exhausting, right? Understanding my emotions, communicating them back, going back and forth, that's where we can lead to burnout, which many of us saw during the pandemic, when individuals were just begging to be understood. Similarly, we don't want to be low in terms of empathy. This essentially means like we've put up this blockade, I'm not helping you, you're not helping me, I don't want to be empathetic or try and understand you at all. That's not a good way to live. That's not how we get connected to others. In fact, there's this sweet spot between medium and high, and it fluctuates obviously based on context and circumstances. But I'd also like to highlight that there are many things that go into a person's ability to be empathetic. So when I look at empathy or conduct studies, I break it up into 3 components or variables: emotional contagion, accuracy, and disconnect. So how well or how much do emotions impact you on a daily basis? This means if Susie Q comes into the building and she's angry, oh, you're angry too. That's how well you can catch someone else's emotion. Accuracy is how accurate are you at determining what someone else is feeling, or better yet, what you're feeling. And then thirdly, your ability to disconnect. So let's say a coworker comes in, they're really sad and down, and it's really impacting your workday because they continually talk about it. Your ability to disconnect can impact your empathy levels. But not only is this how empathy is measured, remember, from our definition, empathy is when our emotions are trying to communicate to us. And so when I was teaching COM 320, I said, let's break it down into a communicative message. Your emotions and other people's emotions are sending this little message to you, right? Think of it as like a DM or a text message, like, hey, this is the next question you need to ask when you see this. 5 emotions I'm going to highlight include anger, boredom, fear, happiness, and depression. When you or yourself feel angry, you need to ask yourself in that moment, what must be protected? How is my identity being influenced? What do I need to restore in this moment? Boredom. What is being avoided? What do I need to be conscious about? Fear. What action should be taken? I'm afraid of the unknown. What am I truly uncertain about in this moment? Happiness, because I had to throw in a good one, right? A little cheerful one. You need to thank yourself for that moment and have gratitude and be hopeful and look forward to the future. Similarly, if you know someone who's really excited and happy, ask questions about the next steps. Keep them on that roll. And then finally, depression, which I would like to clarify. When I say depression, I'm not talking about hormonal or neurological depression symptoms. I'm talking about situational depression, such as like those acute stressors, very often associated with temporary loneliness. We need to ask ourselves, where has my energy gone? And why was it sent away? When I was preparing this speech, I had this mindset that we don't really know how to communicate our emotions, and it's really hard for us to interpret others' emotions. And yesterday, while I was touring this cute little town, I went to Grounds Coffee, a local coffee shop, and when I was checking out, I talked with the baristas. I said, hey, I just want to get a gauge on this, right? Do you feel like our society is good or capable of communicating and understanding emotions? How empathetic do you think we are? And to my surprise, they said, oh, we're so good at communicating emotions. We communicate our emotions all the time. In fact, one barista said, and she said I could use the story, she said it's a true story. She walked into class one day, she sat down, she's prepping her notes, and a random woman sits next to her and says, hi, I'm Madison, and I'm depressed and lonely. She froze. And the barista looked at me and said, people are constantly telling me about their emotions. It's overwhelming. It's not that I don't understand what they're trying to say, but can we develop a relationship first? And she says, we see it on social media, right? People are constantly posting their emotions all the time. And essentially, what this kind of made me realize is we've created this technological society where we're burning ourselves out from our own emotions and others' emotions. It's not that we're unempathetic individuals and we don't understand what emotions are communicating, it's that we're tired. When I made this revelation, it also made me realize that a lot of these revelations often can feel like equations or math problems. So when my mom was released from prison, I would lay awake at night and I would say, okay, I am lonely and I want to get to connected. Loneliness plus blank equals connection. I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to be extroverted because contrary to popular belief, I'm actually extremely introverted. And I was like, I'm going to practice being extroverted. And so I did it, and what I found is that it got me a lot of attention, and a lot of people looked at me, but I still went home, and I still felt lonely. I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to go to college, and I'm going to go to therapy, because therapy is the end-all answer, right? I went to therapy, and it was really great at helping me be self-reflective of like, oh, that's why I communicate like this, and this is why I act like this. But I left the meetings, and I still was lonely because I didn't have a social connection with others. It wasn't until I began to enhance my communication skills and interact with those around me and enhance my interpersonal skills that I realized that's the aha answer to connection and to mitigate feelings of loneliness. So now that I know this answer, why isn't it readily available to the general public? Well, let's take a look at what our society is communicating to us about the solution from loneliness to connection. The US Surgeon General, if you read his 60-page report, 60-plus page report, he gives a 6-pillar solution. And in these pillars, he essentially says we need to work with local communities. We need pro-social policies. We need to mobilize health sectors so that we can help individuals who are isolated. We need to deepen our knowledge. We need to understand digital environments. We need to build a culture of knowledge around why connection is important. Similarly, Johann Hari, the author from the beginning of this speech, says, hey, if you are lonely, you need to essentially reassess your life. And if you have a job that you absolutely hate, you need to quit that job, right? You don't feel connected with those around you, you need to volunteer. These are really great tips by both Hari and Dr. Murthy, but they're Murthy's is very organizational based, top down. These are what organizations need to be doing to help strengthen the community in terms of mitigating feelings of loneliness and getting to a level of connectedness. Hari's examples and solutions examples on how to get to a level of connectedness are great. But for the woman or man who is a single parent working 3 jobs to feed 2 mouths, asking them to volunteer their time or to quit one of the jobs that they hate is a joke. It's not saying that these things aren't beneficial. We just have to assess what we all individually can do here today, right? Because a recent article came out on August 26th of this year by The Atlantic titled "Young Adults Are in a Crisis" by Faith Hill. And she explains, I don't think we're going to therapize or medicate our way out of this problem, speaking to the loneliness epidemic. The way we are going to get out of this problem is by what we talked about today, through understanding what communication really means, being self-reflective of how our communication from our past influences who we are today, and practicing effective communication tactics. And when you do this, you will help people like Nuri, you will help people like myself and my mother, and now that you have this knowledge, you have the power to do this. But you have to go out and apply it. And so that is your challenge today. You now have the power to not only help people such as Nuri and myself, but to also help yourself. And that's how communication can mitigate loneliness. Thank you. questions?